This is our final talk in the Scholarship of Everyday Life Coffee series, and we have 4 exciting guests to tell us about the different ways that coffee matters in a range of fields and disciplines and professions. So I'm going to start out by introducing all of our panelists, and then our panelists will answer, each one will address sort of how coffee is important in their field, and then there's a brief series of questions, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A from the audience. But I want to get started with introducing Dr. Peter Martin, who is the founder of Vanderbilt's Institute of Coffee Studies back in 1999. Dr. Martin now, his research and scholarly interests, I think, are more focused on, in his clinical work, treating drug use and addictive disorders, and his research and scholarly interests include the molecular basis, diagnosis, and treatment of drug use disorders with an emphasis on substance-induced mental disorders. Back in 1999, when he founded the Institute of Coffee Studies, it was focusing really on the physiological effects of coffee drinking. And then in 2007, the Institute sort of shifted to thinking about coffee in a sort of larger, more interdisciplinary way, which is sort of where we are taking up this question of coffee in multiple disciplines now. So our other guests are Professor Holly Tucker, who is the Mellon Foundation Professor of the Humanities and the Director of Vanderbilt's Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. Holly has written 2 amazing books about French cultural history and science, blood work about blood transfusion and the history of blood transfusion, and City of Light, City of Poison, about Paris and the founding of the first police department. Our other guest is Amanda Little, who is a journalist that writes about the environment, technology, and innovation. She is also a professor in Vanderbilt's English department and the communication of science and technology. She is most recently the author of The Fate of Food, What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, and Smarter World, which I just recently finished reading. But she's also written Power Trip, the story of America's love affair with energy. She also currently writes for Bloomberg and has published her reporting and commentary in the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, New York Magazine, The Washington Post, and others. We're very lucky to have her here today talking about coffee production today and climate change, and how climate change affects coffee production today. Our final guest is Professor Tiffany Ruby Patterson of Vanderbilt's African American and Diaspora Studies Department, as well as History and American Studies. Her research and teaching areas include Africans in the Atlantic world in the 19th and 20th centuries, the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and class, intellectuals and political movements in empire, and history in film, novels, and art. She's, in addition to being the co-editor of Palimpsest, a journal on women and gender and the Black International, she is also the author of Zora Neale Hurston and a History of Southern Life. We're really lucky to have Professor Patterson with us today to talk about coffee's history. So thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to get us started with just the question of, why are you interested in coffee, and how does coffee matter in your particular research and field? So I think we'll get started with Dr. Martin.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. One of the good things about doing this by Zoom is you have your computer really handy. And I've searched my co-speakers, who I didn't know personally, and very, very impressed by the fact that such scholars are interested in the field that I thought I was the only one interested in at one point here at Vanderbilt. It's an interesting story. I was contacted in, I guess, what, the 90s by a Brazilian physician who had been thinking about coffee's benefits to health. And he knew of Vanderbilt's reputation in pharmacology. And I'm I was in pharmacology as well, and addiction in psychiatry. And he said, you know, we started communicating back and forth about doing some research on trying to demonstrate that coffee is actually healthful. You got to remember that when I was in medical school in the 70s, coffee was considered to be harmful. We were taught that coffee causes cancer, coffee causes high blood pressure, coffee causes heart disease, all kinds of bad things. And I was very, very wary about having a relationship with the Brazilian coffee industry. And, you know, I sort of had flashbacks of what happened to the University of Kentucky when they started having studying tobacco. Tobacco was another thing that doctors at one point thought was good and then was bad, demonstrated to be bad. I didn't want to be, I didn't want to wind up in something like that. So at any rate, we started negotiating back and forth, and it took over 2 years, really. I mean, I wanted to be a pure scientist, you know, literally pure. I didn't want to be, I didn't want didn't want to bring any problems to Vanderbilt. But to cut a long story short, about 2 years later, we had the founding of the Vanderbilt Institute for Coffee Studies. Around the table were people from all of South America and Central America, and also our vice chancellor at that point, our head of the medical center, Harry Jacobson, and we signed this format. And the next day it was above the fold in the Tennessean. Interestingly enough, it was the day that Bill Clinton was impeached. And on that day, we were above the fold because it was a big, big day for us anyways. Well, what happened is that we did some interesting research on, so the idea was that I was not particularly interested in proving that coffee was good or bad. I was more interested in understanding how coffee caused beneficial effects. This is really a distinction because by the time that they came to us, there was a fair amount of switch in the epidemiologic studies. There were now epidemiologic studies showing benefits of coffee for a variety of things. Let me see, I can actually even look at some of my notes here. So there were epidemiologic studies showing reduced rates of suicide in coffee drinkers. There were studies showing reduced cardiovascular deaths, some benefits in Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, reduction in rates of cancer, and the beginnings of what really stimulated me was that alcoholics who tend to develop cirrhosis had less liver disease if they were coffee drinkers. And so I had this notion that maybe there's something in coffee that might actually be beneficial in the treatment of alcoholism and addiction. But the idea was that taking these epidemiologic studies, I wanted to develop hypotheses whereby we could actually try to figure out the mechanisms of the diseases that were epidemiologically shown to be reduced because of coffee drinking. So none of this business of it's dangerous, it's not dangerous, it was mechanistic. So we wanted to understand how the low rates of suicide might be implicated in treatment of depression or treatment of anxiety. We wanted to understand how reduced cardiovascular deaths might be involved in reducing atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries. We wanted to see whether we could get some clues on neurodegenerative disorders, dementias. We wanted to see if there were ways we could unravel cancer a little bit better. And then finally, the thing that interested me most, and in fact, there were a lot of different people involved in our institute at the time who had interests in these different areas. I was very much interested in coffee related to reducing craving and drinking of alcohol, and perhaps in protection against obesity. And of course, these are the big problems in our society at this point, as far as medicine is concerned. Alcohol, drugs, obesity, cardiovascular disease, depression. I mean, you list it. And it was to me almost, really interesting that in this bean, this coffee bean, there could be these compounds that might have some benefits. And so we basically looked at the compounds in coffee, purified some of them, actually synthesized some of them. And we demonstrated that these compounds, not caffeine, mind you, chlorogenic acids, that was one of the big things we did, is that we identified that there were a bunch of compounds in coffee that were opposite in action to caffeine. They reduced anxiety. They calmed as opposed to excited. And it was almost like the yin yang. And we're having this discussion with marijuana right now, that marijuana has THC and tetrahydrocannabinol, as well as the other compounds, which are actually opposing the actions. But at any rate, to cut the story short, because I know you have other people, what ultimately happened is that nothing much changed. And in the period last 10 years, there have been lots and lots of papers coming out. And the most impressive that basically proved what we were saying about coffee's benefit. It reduced all-cause mortality in large epidemiological sample. And that was a New England Journal in 2014. So it felt good to start this and, see it progress and move forward.
So looking at the chat, it seems that a lot of our participants are indeed heavy coffee drinkers. So I think that's good news for all of us here, Dr. Martin. Thank you. And I'm also fascinated by what you said about coffee being a way to study other things as well, not just the coffee, but a way to study other things. So I'm going to move on and ask Professor Patterson if you would like to talk about coffee, because I know that some of your expertise reaches back into the history of coffee, and share for just about 5 minutes, why coffee? Why is coffee important in your field and in your work?
First of all, coffee was founded in Africa, and my field is the comparative history of African people. It was founded in Ethiopia in the 6th century, and Ethiopia also invaded Yemen and occupied it for quite a long time, thereby spreading coffee into the Arab world, and it became a heavily desired drink. But I'm interested in it because of slavery. It is also tied to the Atlantic slave trade. In the late 19th century, another bean, a coffee bean, the Robusta bean, was discovered, as opposed to the Arabica beans, which are considered the prime bean for making coffee. It was found in the Belgian Congo at the moment of colonialism. Well, see, one of my passionate areas is European colonialism in Africa, and especially the Belgian Congo. That had been a virus, I guess you would call it, that called coffee rust in English, that had destroyed the coffee plantations in Ceylon and the Dutch East Indies. And this bean was the one that took its place. It was banned on the stock exchange, but it was part of the world of coffee. It became very much a part of the world of coffee. The slaves cultivated coffee up until about the 1820s. I'm sorry, cultivated sugar up until about the 1820s. I have a colleague named Nancy Applebaum that used to teach a course in New York where I worked called Breakfast in the Americas, and it was all about coffee and sugar. But sugar declined in terms of production in the early part of the 19th century. And coffee took its place in some of those very same places. Slaves switched to mining. They switched from mining to coffee cultivation in Rio de Janeiro and Brazil, for example, which became a big coffee producer. The slaves died from harsh conditions. It was a very harsh practice of slavery. They died almost within 7 years of being brought to Brazil to grow coffee. The imports, for example, rose from 26,254 in 1825 to 43,555 in 1828. More than 1 million slaves were in Brazil by that time, and nearly a third of the country's population. The pressure from the British at this is about the time that slavery is also being challenged as a form of labor. The pressure from the British forced Brazil to outlaw slavery in 1831, but did not enforce the law. Knowing that slave trade was coming to an end, Brazil increased the imports to 60,000 by 1848. British warships captured the Brazilian ships and forced the legislature to ban the importations in 1850. Thousands of African people died producing coffee in Brazil. And the coffee was growing in its importance as a product in this period. Sugar was already there, and coffee was also being grown in Haiti. And I don't want to go past the 5 minutes, but that's another important story. I teach a course on Haiti, and the creation of maroon economics in Haiti involved growing coffee on small plots of land. I'll stop there. There's more to say about the history, but very briefly, my interest is in the rise of colonialism and anti-colonial struggles and the economies that supported those struggles. And coffee, along with cotton, along with sugar, would be some of the most important areas of those economies.
I'm fascinated by the way that these stories of sort of climate and environmental shifts, like the coffee rust that you were talking about, how they're intertwined with the story both of sort of coffee and global commodities, but also intertwined with the story of racial and social justice.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Patterson. And I'm going to hand it over to sort of the other side of maybe the sort of European side of the history of coffee, the sort of dovetailing or sort of running in parallel. Professor Tucker, could you tell us more about coffee and its role in Europe and during the sort of same time period or during this sort of Enlightenment period?
Yeah, so there's a nice segue from what Professor Patterson talked about into what I tend to look at. In fact, I've put together a little bit of show and tell. If we could throw up those slides. Right, so I work in the 17th and 18th centuries. And of course, this is a time of, as Professor Patterson pointed out, of huge amounts of travel and the colonialist impulse, right? So the map makers are out there supporting the travelers, and they come back with all different types of stories, sometimes of sea creatures, as you can see vaguely on the bottom right, as well as stories of other cultures and certainly their products. And as we know, it's also a time of domination of those cultures and basically a raiding of the riches in those countries. And so next slide. What you see in the 17th century literature images very similar to the one on the left, right? Indigenous peoples, their coffee beans, their chocolate, and then also their coffee, right? Tea, coffee, spices. So in the middle, the story of coffee is actually intertwined very closely with the story of chocolate, in fact. And so in the middle, you can see the Indian nectar or a discourse concerning chocolate. And because all of these were mythical, fascinating commodities. The Europeans had not really seen the chocolate or coffee before, and they'd certainly not seen the peoples to whom those products were, to whom they belonged. I work in the history of medicine, and so the part that is most interesting to me is how those novel products actually were understood in regard to health and healing. And coffee and chocolate, I will focus primarily on coffee, really was seen primarily in medical terms at the very beginning. In fact, it was seen as an aphrodisiac, so it can increase a libido, and for that, it was also used in a very concentrated form, like curing like. So coffee serum or coffee syrup would be used on the sores and sexually transmitted diseases, right? Makes sense. If it's going to increase libido, then it would also help take care of the after effects of sexual intercourse. And so you can find, and there's on the far right, there's a treatise 1663, a coffee man's granado discharged upon the maiden's complaint against coffee. And this is not a real court case that came through from my understanding, but really a pamphlet demonstrating the dangers of coffee, right? A maiden is complaining that a man drank too much coffee and then tried to approach her, right? So we get already entwined, we get race, we get colonialism, we get sex, we get gender, right? When it comes to chocolate, what's super interesting about chocolate is all the mythology around that, a fear that if one would eat too much chocolate, particularly a pregnant woman would eat too much chocolate, is that her baby would be born brown, right? Because not only is it a reflection of the item itself, the chocolate itself, but also too this fear of the very origins, is that there's something very black even in the chocolate itself that's associated with the peoples in whose country it belonged. Last slide. So for me, in addition to the history of medicine angle, I'm also, as a cultural historian, very interested in what it does to European society. Right, coffee was extraordinarily expensive, upwards of $4,000 to $5,000 modern dollars a pound, and so it was imbibed primarily by the elite. It was also imbibed primarily by the court. And in fact, the first coffee that we see served in private homes was in France around the 1640s. And it didn't take very long at all from about 1640 for it to make its way by the 1650s, 1660s into what would be new coffee houses in large European cities, primarily England, London, and Paris. And then as well, we don't really see it coming into the New World and into the United States until about 1689. The first coffee house was in Boston in 1689. Now, this is really important. First, it begins in the elite private homes, and then it moves into coffee houses. When we start to look at what happens, the late 17th century, moving into the 18th centuries, that's a time of extraordinary revolution. We have the American Revolution, we also have the French Revolution. And we know that many of the revolutionaries congregated, particularly in Paris, around certain cafes. Certain cafes were associated with different factions. And it was now a public space of discourse and also disruption, right? So for me, coffee encapsulates the entire early modern period. It encapsulates all of the beginnings of social inequity around race, gender, sex. It also encapsulates the downfall of the old regime into the beginnings of democracy. And I'm super interested in the whole idea is that coffee being so associated with the beginnings of democracy is also in itself such a fraught product of inequity and colonialism and power disparity. So for me, it just encapsulates entirely my field, essentially.
Thank you so much. Right, that is one of the fascinations of coffee, is the sort of dual effects and the ways that it's always been seen in having the sort of intertwined effects both on the physical body and on the social body. Professor Little, I think we're now moving sort of really into not just coffee now, but coffee in the future, and what's going to happen to our coffee as we're living in a hotter, faster, smarter world.
Thank you so much for including me in this conversation. I'm looking at Holly, wondering if she's in fact drinking coffee, and really wishing that I hadn't drained this thermos of coffee, because I love this beverage and all the stories that surround it.
Amanda, I'm really sorry to tell you, I don't drink coffee anymore. This is herbal tea. I was afraid to mention that to anybody, or you'll kick me out of this session.
Well, Peter, I'm delighted to know that my affection for coffee it can be seen as a virtuous thing from a health standpoint, and potentially from a libido.
I'm not sure virtuous is the word, but it's healthy. It's healthful.
Healthful, yes, so long as it's not abused. Well, I have looked at climate pressures on a whole range of crops globally, and my book, The Fate of Food, doesn't focus on coffee, but I have done quite a bit of research on it, and it's very interesting in the, and when we think about the ways in which climate change is radically changing what we eat and how we grow it. Humanity, consumes 500 billion cups of coffee every year, which is almost double the number a decade ago. And there are 20 million, 25 million farmers. You get different numbers where depending on where you look. But there are 20 million farmers who supply this global habit. And increasingly, it's growing, particularly in throughout Southeast Asia and in China. So the demand is growing pretty dramatically. But what's interesting and very concerning is that the industry, and particularly the farmers, face dire economic and environmental pressures. I've interviewed coffee farmers and researchers in Guatemala, in Ethiopia, and in Kenya about how they're grappling with these increasingly volatile growing conditions, and about the serious problems, dire problems that are facing smallholder farmers, and both in terms of how they're adapting to the this big gap between what they're paid for their crop and what the crop, how what consumers are willing to pay for this crop, particularly in the U.S. and Europe, and how they're also adapting to these increasing pressures. So Arabica coffees are known to be Goldilocks crops, meaning that they don't like too much rainfall or too little rainfall. They're like very specific conditions in which to thrive, and they don't like too high temperatures or too low temperatures. They like distinct heat differences between day and night, and so as diurnal rhythms promote the formation of sugars and other carbohydrates in the fruit, that influences the flavor of the beans. So when you're throwing off seasons, when you're throwing off moisture levels, when you're throwing off those diurnal rhythms because of global warming patterns, it has a huge impact on coffee producers. And in 2016, when I was in the throes of research for my book, the Climate Institute released a report detailing how warming trends were bearing down on coffee farms in key countries in what's called the Bean Belt, which includes Ethiopia, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and El Salvador. And coffee plants, as I mentioned, they, because they are fickle, because they like very specific conditions, dry, relatively cool conditions, they're sort of a bellwether crop. They're an indicator of pressures that are very real for certainly coffee producers, but any number of other crops in the that are grown in the dry tropics, and I'll get to that. But coffee in particular is, coffee producers are dealing with rising temperatures that have begun to slow and stunt berry growth. Hotter weather is fueling the introduction of pests, such as the coffee berry borer. And I think Professor Patterson mentioned coffee rust fungus, which has been a problem for a very long time, but is becoming a much greater problem. The leaf rust fungus is affected by humidity levels. And so the increasing humidity levels in certain regions is fueling this scourge of leaf rust. It's already killed off millions of acres of coffee crops in South America alone. The Climate Institute reports predict that given warming trends by 2050, the amount of suitable farmland for coffee will be cut in half. That's 30 years from now, unless we find ways to adapt. So that was what I was exploring this in my book and talking to farmers about what they were doing to adapt. Again, because there are so many farmers and so many smallholder farmers, adaptation is much harder and more difficult to sort of organize in this industry than in, say, corn production or commodity crops that are grown on large scales and on large farms. There was one scientist named Thomas Oberthur, who he is in the Land Use Climate Division at CIAT, which is an international agriculture and sustainability organization. And he described the pressure on coffee farmers in this very chilling way to me. And he said, I hear a lot of folks say that coffee farmers can just move into environments which previously were not suitable for coffee, but because of climate change are now becoming suitable. Well, coffee plants like mountainous environments. And the only more suitable condition for growing coffee will be higher up the mountain. And there are only so many mountains in equatorial regions, and the higher you move, the smaller the area gets. So sooner or later, all that will be left to farm for coffee farmers are the rocky tips of mountains. And that was just so, I just had this image of coffee farming sort of moving up and up and up to the tips of these mountains to supply this increasing global demand for this product, and these shrinking regions that are capable of growing coffee. And again, what goes for coffee also goes off, but mostly for tea and cacao and other high value specialty products, such as tropical fruits and nuts, that again, we really can't grow in the US given the conditions we have here. Also, we're deeply dependent, of course, on the supply from regions that are dealing with really the worst impacts of climate change. And I'll just wrap up my little segment here by sharing that more than 2 billion people, about a third of the global population, live in the dry tropical regions that produce most of these crops that we love so well. David Lobel of Stanford Center on Food Security walked me through his climate modeling in these regions, and they are more vulnerable than any other. They will suffer the worst impacts of climate change. So if you look at climate models, the conditions are projected, this is a quote from Lobel, to intensify here more than in any other climatic region. So the already hot, dry climates will become really hot and really dry relative to their current state. There is a huge amount of time and energy that's, increasingly, there hasn't been until very recently, time and energy and funding focused on adaptation. And we can talk about that. I know there's not a whole lot of time left to discuss, but I'm happy to share, some insights into how farmers and scientists are researching adaptation. So I will leave it there.
So I just put in the chat, there's a link to your article, Amanda, on Bloomberg.com about one of the sort of attempts to find a technological way to deal with these disruptions to the coffee industry. Now, one of the things that we are interested in is because we have so many people looking at coffee from different angles. I think your answers made it clear what sorts of problems, what sorts of insights, what sorts of issues studying coffee or the study of coffee can address within your fields. But I'm also interested in thinking about how can the study of coffee, how might those insights be useful in other fields, or how might the work in your own field be enriched by sort of communication with other fields? So I'm just going to sort of pop that question in the chat, and I'm going to open it out to whoever wants to respond to that. And we'll try.
Well, let me begin by saying that it was always my hope when we started the Institute is to expand it into the humanities. And because one of my hypotheses was that at the time that we started the Institute, that was a time when cocaine addiction was a big deal in the US. And one of my thoughts was that the land on which cocaine is grown and the land on which coffee is grown is much similar. They're very similar. And I had these fantastical ideas that we in the US might actually give money to South American farmers to grow coffee instead of cocaine, and thereby help the cocaine epidemic. It was for that reason our friendship with Ted Fisher sort of bloomed, because he was trying to build the what's it called? CAS, Center for Latin American Studies, yeah. And at that point, he felt that coffee was a big part of of Latin America. And so we sort of started to talk, and it became very clear that over the years, the scientific, or the, let's put it this way, the physiological and medical aspects of coffee, you know, are not being much researched into. I've gone on to other things, but it seems that a lot of the other issues related to coffee, as its role in humanity, have expanded at Vanderbilt. So my heart is bursting to see all you guys interested in coffee. So, at any rate, I think that that there is a lot of room for pollination among fields.
Thank you. Any other responses?
Yes, I'm interested. I'm a historian by training, and historians have the unique possibility of sitting in two big areas, the humanities and the social sciences, of marrying those two together in terms of the kinds of sources that we use. And I'm interested in colonialism and post-colonial societies because of slavery, because of the incredible destruction of millions and millions of African people as they were moved to this part of the world. And I'm interested, I hadn't thought of coffee as being a way to think about maybe a course, because getting students interested in these histories is very difficult, particularly since the university has taken practically no responsibility in making sure that students are educated on certain things as they go into the modern world. And slavery and the rise of race as a concept and racism and so on is a part of that. And when you get into, the previous speaker was talking about what it takes to grow the good coffee, the Arabica beans. The reason the other bean is used is because it can grow not necessarily needed up on the mountains and so on. But I'm thinking about the people who actually produce the coffee. And I like what Dr. Martin, I think that he was one saying that, that we could think about fostering coffee production and getting money to get workers, and not forced labor like it was before. That would be a way to address the human question of workers and poor workers, because the history of coffee in Africa and in the Caribbean, for example, was a history of forced labor, even after slavery ended into the 20th century. And the last thing I'll point out, I remembered that Houphouët Boigny, who was a part of the French Assembly from Cote d'Ivoire, from Ivory Coast, it's a statement in here where he says to the people, going back to what Professor Tucker was talking about, that they should grow coffee and cocoa for chocolate. And they would be better served that way, because if you don't want to vegetate, the quote is, if you don't want to vegetate in bamboo huts, concentrate on coffee and cocoa. They will fetch a good price and you will become rich. That coffee is not then produced by the poorest people of our planet, but rather produced as a way of enhancing both the health and the economic health of some of the people who are descendants of those poor populations. I don't know if I made that clear. So.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. Amanda, did you want to jump in?
Oh, sure. I began to, I sort of gestured at this, but I think the solutions to stabilizing and enhancing and empowering coffee producers, coffee farmers, connecting them directly to the kind of scientific information and weather meteorological information they need to prepare for and adapt to increasingly difficult growing conditions, and connecting them directly to retailers who sell their products is going to be essential to sustaining small holder farms. And that's true in the coffee industry, and that's true in, again, so many among so many crops in the dry tropics, which are incredibly populous. It's going to be essential to maintaining livelihoods and economies in that region. The coffee supply chain is more complex than any other for Robusta and Arabica, but mostly for Arabica, because the Arabica beans are produced on small scale, 1 and 2 hectare farms. The Robusta is monocropped on large scale farms, generally speaking. But there are incredible complexities in coffee production. Beans can change hands half a dozen times as they move through the process of harvesting and drying and fermenting and storing and importing and roasting. And there's very little transparency in an industry that's so fragmented. And so it's a system that comes from colonialism, and for centuries, the global North has been consuming coffee produced by the global South. And that severe power imbalance still exists in large scale, largely because the coffee supply chain is so complex and fragmented. So it significantly disempowers the coffee farmers. They're producing so much value, and on a cup of coffee that might cost $4 or $5 or $6, they're getting 10 cents on that cup of coffee or less, depending on the data. So bridging that gap, and networks, technology and communication networks can help do that. But bridging that gap so that producers can connect directly with retailers and get around, again, that deeply fragmented supply chain with with so little transparency, will really empower smallholder farmers and coffee producers, and it will help them get the information that's necessary to adapt to these increasingly difficult conditions. And I will say that also, what's happening in the science of coffee production is they're drawing on the wisdom of ancient plants. They're doing a lot of research into the genomes of ancient coffee plants. that have survived, hostile climate conditions, that learned how to adapt over, millennia to hostile climate conditions. And they're trying to borrow from that ancient wisdom and use modern tools, modern breeding tools, to breed in the wisdom of the ancient plants into modern coffee plants that can be, accessible and affordable to the, again, 20 to 25 million Arabica producers in equatorial nations. So that is that knowledge and that wisdom that is emerging in among coffee scientists and among coffee producers is very relevant and important beyond the coffee industry.
But I'm going to jump in and just say is that the part of that that's really interesting, yes, is that there's this full circle, right? Is the very thing that we might be leaning back to is to do these genomic studies. Those are coming from the 18th century botanists who were at the beginning, right, of the very ravaging, right, of these lands, of these crops, and the capitalist moves that so there's an irony, right? There is that what is leading to the destruction of these crops is actually what we're going to be leaning on to be able to help save them. There's another part of this, as someone who works in natural history and history of medicine, that I just think is so fascinating, is that you have the old world travelers going into these lands, right? And they're strangers in this environment and they don't know what to make out of it. And there's, deep fears. If I spend a year in Jamaica, basically, doing any type of export type of work, will I eventually myself end up changing color, right? Will my roots end up changing? And so there's this, like, I'm not quite sure about what this environment I'm in right now and what it's going to do to me and to my body and to my world. And we're, in the sense, because of that exploratory and also colonialist impulse, we're in the process of being strangers in our own environments again. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but there is, you look at, the natural histories. I think about the East Indian Trading Company, right? And the beginnings of the British Museum, Sir Hans Sloane, and these drawers upon drawers upon drawers of things that were taken from other lands. They're both fantastic to have, but it's also pillaging the same type of pillaging that we're doing now.
So I had a final question about asking you all how you thought coffee could be an avenue for engaging audiences beyond the university and thinking about in sort of understanding what we do as researchers in multiple fields. But I also wanted to have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to solicit questions from the audience. You can take yourself off mute and just ask a question, or you can put it in the chat because we are coming up on, we got around 7 minutes left. So if anybody has a question, I noticed Sarah mentioned that earlier in the chat, she pointed out that the first occurrence of rust disease was just reported in Hawaii last week. So we see that these things that we're talking about as part of the history of coffee are also very much part of the present of coffee. Anybody in the audience want to ask a question? I think you guys have been touching on issues that we've been seeing in our talk with Ted Fisher and with Alicia Adams and Phyllis Johnson last week. If not, then I'm just going to throw my question in there.
I have about engaging audience. I think you can engage audience because around coffee, and I had not thought about it until I was invited to do this, because a lot of us drink a lot of coffee. I think I would have floated away in coffee when I was in graduate school because I had to stay up for so late to do the work. And I was constantly drinking coffee. I was drinking 5 or 6 cups of coffee a day. And I'm glad to hear from Dr. Martin that it's not as damaging as I thought it was. And I drink a cup every day now. That's an avenue into a whole population on and off campus. Because people drink coffee. And I think that there are creative ways to do programming around coffee, both in terms of what's happening to the coffee growers. I was really fascinated with Dr. Martin's discussion, which I didn't know about. I've heard some of it, but not as the way he put it, about coffee being good for you and not being the source of cancer, and not being someone who struggled with cancer and other kinds of diseases, and worried about drinking so much coffee that I could damage myself even more. I think especially in Tennessee, there's a population of people who need to know that information and need to engage. And it's a way, I think, of getting into larger questions about social justice. Yep. And about I'm a historian, so I want people to know the history. I mean, I'm almost manic, having gone through this election with students and others who don't know any history. And so I think there is so many creative ways, as I started thinking about this, that we can do something as an institution to engage a larger audience on and off campus.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quickly add to that. I think that those are such great points, Professor Patterson. And I think that, particularly students and grad students are witnessing now the rise of the third way, this third wave of coffee production. So the first wave was driven in the 1950s by Maxwell House and Folgers and so on. And the second wave by chains like Starbucks and Pete's and so on. And this third wave is this increasing focus on higher cost, single origin, artisanal coffees that that really reward the farmer in a much more important way, that value the subtleties of the flavors that they're producing, that connect single origin farmers to retailers. There's a lot of education coming from the coffee roasters and the coffee retailers about the origin of the product. I mean, it's a very, very high cost product, but that is very real to Gen Z and millennial consumers, and it is just expanding on what Dr. Patterson was saying, that this is a way to tell a story, right? And these third way, retailers and roasters are beginning to tell that story of what single origin and production is like, and who is producing these crops, and what the conditions are, and that is and what the deep history is behind that. I mean, it's a crucial storytelling opportunity.
But let me just stop. When I was approached by the South Americans, the Brazilians, the price of coffee was way, way down. In fact, this was, in some ways, I would say, an advertising strategy for them, to make coffee more desirable, because people were drinking very little coffee in the 90s, relatively speaking, compared to in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And what happened is that Colombia and Brazil and all these countries were going bankrupt, because coffee is more traded among nations. The only commodity ahead of coffee is oil. And so it's a very powerful political thing, the sale of coffee and the manufacture of coffee and all these other things we're talking about. So it's got a really interesting phenomenon that it can be used as a lubricant to bring peoples together, nations together. I traveled a hell of a lot during that time, because everyone, I don't know if there's an International Coffee Organization, which is very similar to the United Nations. It's got, in fact, when I was asked to speak there, it reminded me of the UN. It was remarkable. You sit in a place and people translate what you're saying into 5 languages. there are people, one of the big issues is that in China, at one point, there was very little coffee drunk. And this was viewed as an opportunity for the coffee producers because, I mean, there are many, many beautiful stories that you could talk about. And, I think coffee is very useful to bring people together and to learn new cultures and communicate among each other.
Holly, you want to take us out with an insight about coffee and the humanities? As you've been thinking about, how do we engage audiences in thinking about coffee? How do we engage people in thinking about the humanities? Oh, or I noticed an audience question. Sarah, you want to go ahead?
Is that okay? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Grant. I'm at California State University, Fullerton, and I'm a coffee researcher. And I've been struggling a lot with this question of engaging specifically industry audiences. I research Robusta in Vietnam, and as many of you probably know, this is a part of the coffee world that's largely invisible, I think, except for the big four. Nestle obviously buys a lot of Vietnamese coffee, but just trying to have a conversation with, let's say, specialty coffee enthusiasts and industry members about why Vietnam's story matters for the industry at large is really difficult, because I think, if Ted Fisher was here, he would say, like, well, obviously this is a question of value and quality and how these things have all been shaped over time. But I think in the face of climate change, Vietnam is increasingly important, and, just trying to frame the question of why Robusta matters for specialty has been kind of a big project I've been trying to get off the ground as an interdisciplinary collaborative project. And some people in industry are interested in having these conversations, but it requires someone who is looking for 88 point and above coffees to value an 83 point coffee or below in new ways, and understand that maybe this is what the future of coffee looks like when rust disease takes over, when you only have these, desolate landscapes at 500 meters above sea level where coffee is, sort of thriving right now, but not for much longer. So I know that's not really a question, but I think engaging industry is easy when you're talking about what matters to industry. It's much more difficult when you're talking about changing the way coffee has been constructed over these last 3 waves.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think that's actually really a useful insight to sort of wrap this up, is thinking about how is what we are doing with the Scholarship of Everyday Life program, with the Coffee Equity Lab that Haynes and Ginny are running over at the Wond'ry in the social innovations practice area. How is this a way to sort of connect what we do as scholars with what our students are interested in making an impact, and what consumers need to understand as they make these choices? And how do we make those things impact an industry as fragmented and different in various areas as the coffee sector? Haynes, did you want to add anything to that?
I think you've said it really well.
All right. Well, I want to wrap up by thanking everyone who participated today. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much, Tiffany and Holly. I'm sorry Amanda had to jump off early, but really lovely to see you all. And I hope you all are doing okay during this undoubtedly stressful time, but it was nice to take a moment away from that and think about connections, community, and coffee. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.